Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know by now, because we're in our 25th year, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished in the past, what they might be projecting for the future. We also have other brands of artists on sometimes. We've had on photographers, sculptors, actors, composers. It's a pretty wide net. So if you have an idea for a guest who might be good for the Writer's Block, writer or otherwise, watch for our address at the end of the program. We'd be very happy to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block and all the other original programming that comes out of Cape Ann TV is a product of local cable access television. You don't get that with Dish, so don't be tempted to switch in the future. Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have a photographer, an artist of a different brand than our usual type, and it's always a good, refreshing episode to talk to somebody who's working in a different medium. Our guest tonight's Tom Robinson Cox, who is originally from Englewood, New Jersey, and he told me just a few minutes ago that he began his career in photography and his interest in photography when he was 8 years old. And then, lucky for him, because his mother did well at the track when he was 13, she bought him a brand new F-Nikon and some other photography equipment to propel him on his way. That way continued to Mount Herman in Massachusetts, where he was a staff photographer and head of the photography club. And then later he took at MIT every photography course they offered as he continued his education there as a double major in industrial management and art and architecture. He has been in Gloucester since '85, and if you see visit the various art studios around the Cape, you've seen some of Tom Robinson Cox's wonderful photographs. Tom, thanks for coming to the Writer's Block.
My pleasure to be here.
It is a delight to have an artist of a different stamp here because we usually have writers, so it's a refreshing episode.
Well, great.
I've seen some of your work that you take around Cape Ann, and one of the first questions I wanted to ask is when you were 8 and when you were 13, that interest started, but it's continued. Right. How did you keep it alive, or where's all that energy come from?
Well, a good part of the method I kept it alive was that after graduating from college, I decided not to become a professional photographer. I decided to save the art for myself as a means of personal expression as opposed to trying to earn a livelihood with it, which I thought would put pressure on me and make it stale and possibly make it less than the enjoyable views that I find it.
And you'd have to take what you were told to take in many cases, I imagine.
Well, if you were doing a job being a wedding photographer, for instance, it's pretty much on demand. There are set shots you have to get. In fact, these days I do occasionally a wedding for a friend or a relative, but a couple of times my wife and I, she's also a photographer, have been the exclusive photographers for instance, my niece's wedding. And we decided after doing 2 of these that we no longer wanted to be the front photographer. We let our friends and family hire a photographer, and we go around behind the scenes and take candids.
You could be more creative that way?
We could be more creative, we can be more free, and we can enjoy the party more.
Yeah, you can't enjoy a party if you're doing the family and this family and these relatives and those relatives.
Because in a wedding, there's must have shots of the various families, and that was fun and creative. But it was the main focus of the wedding for us.
So you're fun with photography, and the creativity is taking you from 8 years to adulthood, and
almost 60 years of fun.
It's not diminished.
Not a bit.
Where do you get your energy when you go out now on Cape Ann to photograph? Do you wake up and say, I don't want to shoot something, or do you have targets in mind?
Often I'll have a target. For instance, there's one picture that I'll show later. a scene that I saw. I drove by after being at Russell Family Orchards. I was driving down towards Cranes Beach, and I saw a beautiful creek with grasses and mountains and clouds in the background. And I thought, wow, that would be really great in the fall when the grass is turning. It's a beautiful golden color. If I could get there an hour before sunset, and also if it coincided with a high tide, so there'd be water in the creek. So I stalked that shot for over a month. Every day the autumn, when it was high tide, I looked at my calendar, at my tide calendar, and I figured when the tide was high for the last hour of the day, and I would drive from my home in Gloucester out to Ipswich just to get that shot. And it took
Praying
me
that
about
the
six-
weather is going to be.
Well, I would look at the weather. If it was
Decent.
cloudy, I wouldn't go. But I must have visited that site 6 or 7 times to get the shot that I wanted.
And then somebody will look at the photograph and say, "Oh man, that was a lucky shot. He just happened
Right.
to be there at the right time."
Exactly.
You brought a number of photographs. I want
I did.
to get to some of these, and we are. We introduced the show with a beautiful photograph here. Can you explain what we're looking at?
Well, we're looking at a natural fall of coconuts on a place called Long Island in the Bahamas. Last summer, I sailed my 42-foot ocean racing trimaran down to the Bahamas and lived aboard for 5 months. I took over 4,000 pictures, and so far I've printed about a half a dozen of them. So there's a lot more in the archives waiting to be revealed.
A half a dozen.
A half a dozen so far.
6 out of 4,000.
So far.
You've got a ways to go.
Well, my shooting ratio is usually around 1%. So I expect that out of those 4,000 pictures, I'll have 40 really good, solid shots.
This looks to me, from this distance, as if it could be a painting.
It could be.
What equipment did you use to shoot it, and what was the printing process?
Well, the equipment, my camera of choice these days is a Sony NEX7. It is a 24 megapixel mirrorless digital single lens reflex. It's almost pocket size, about the size of an old Leica. And this happens to be a 24 millimeter Zeiss f1.8 lens. It's extremely sharp, distortion free, very fast, and that's the picture. This is the camera I took that picture
Can
with.
you hold that just still in one position?
Yeah.
Can you get that? I want to make sure we get a good picture of that.
Yeah.
You just hold it still for 30 seconds, or is that good?
Joey Shermatero shoots with a Sony NEX5, and he's the one who put the bug in my ear. And then a friend of mine got one of these.
Joey's a former guest on the show.
Then he put a bug, well, with his blog spot, why not? And then a friend of mine got one of these, and I said, that looks pretty good to me.
How much does that camera cost?
The camera is $1,200 with a kit lens, and this lens is another $1,000, just for the lens alone. It's the best lens they make for this camera.
Zeiss, you said.
It's Zeiss. yeah.
Zeiss.
Yeah.
So that's the equipment that you took the picture with,
Right.
and then you had the process of blowing it up,
Yeah.
printing it.
I actually
Describe
printed that.
print
I printed
process.
that about 2 hours ago on my Epson 3800 inkjet printer. It's a photographic quality printer. This is printed on velvet fine art paper, which is very similar to watercolor paper, but it's specially designed to absorb photographic ink.
Just today, before
Today,
the show.
yeah, 2 hours ago, I printed that and put it in this frame. This is a sample of how I show my exhibition prints
I've
in the
seen-
gallery that my wife and
yeah,
I
I've
manage.
I've seen your work in galleries.
Yeah.
That looks so perfectly done. It's difficult for me to imagine it was just done a couple hours ago. You
Well,
know,
the printing was done a couple hours ago. The exposure itself was taken last March, and I took probably a dozen frames of this scene, and this is the one I settled on as being the best composition and exposure and the sharpest in terms of focus. And it's a full frame photograph. Almost all of my photographs are full frame because you work with such a small sensor in digital photography, and I was used to working with a small negative in 35 millimeter photography, that I always try to get as close as possible to the subject, to the portion of the subject or the scene that I see that resonates with me. I took Edward Weston's advice to heart. He was a very famous photographer, a contemporary of Ansel Adams and Minor White. He said, when you're taking a photograph, get close, and then get closer.
That's a common mistake in amateur photography. People try to take a sunset and the sun is about this big.
Right.
They don't have the right, trying to photograph what your imagination
Right.
sees, and it doesn't quite work.
Well,
Can you give us another
Sure.
photograph? I know you've got
Well, here's
several. I want to make sure we could
this has
show our
become-
audience as many
Yeah.
as possible.
This has become recently my signature piece. I hope you can zoom in on that and not be distracted by the background. I call this Boatyard Blues, and I took it at the boatyard where I haul my trimaran out in the winters when I'm not sailing south with it. And a lot of people think this is an abstract
Looks like a clay or
painting.
Paul Klee.
It looks like a clay, but I don't call it an abstract, I call it an extract, because it's a photograph of something that really exists. So it's a natural extract. And in my photographs, I use minimal manipulation. I do adjustments for sharpness, for color balance, for contrast and exposure, but I don't add a lot to the picture that wasn't there.
You don't
in the
mess
native
with the
shot.
reality of the.
I don't Photoshop
Of the
it.
target.
I use Photoshop as my software program, because you have to use some software to output a digital image and be able to print it. But the adjustments I make are minimal. And in this is a picture of an old rotten wooden hull of a boat that's turned upside down and stored underneath some trees for 15 or 20 years. A shredded blue tarp. The plywood is all disintegrating, which makes the grid. All the colors were from different layers of epoxy fairing compound.
These are natural colors.
Well, it's natural in that they're on the object. The colors were made with a mixture of epoxy and dye and applied to the outside of this wooden hull form when the boatyard workers were making the form smooth so they could use it as a mold to make a fiberglass boat. So this is what's known as a plug. It looks like a boat, but it isn't. It's made of plywood and it has the boat shape, and then the fairing compounds are tinted different colors because to make the hull smooth, they have to sand the fairing compound. And this way you know when you're sanding through one layer about to break into another layer because the color starts to change. So these colors are on the hull when I took the picture.
What's what are the measurements of what we're looking at right now?
That is
I mean, how
this-
many inches?
okay. The piece I took a picture of was about twice that size. I'd say it was 3 feet across and about 2 feet high.
There's only one thing I actually recognize. It looks like there's a hinge here, or
Or just a
some
piece of plywood.
metal part there. Is that,
No, it's just part of the deteriorated plywood. I mean, this is more recognizable to most people, the shredded polyethylene tarp. One of those blue woven tarps that just
But
blown apart in the wind.
my first reaction was, as you described, I thought it was abstract, and I thought it was the colors were manipulated. But you
Right.
you do not do that.
No.
And do you move your objects around? If you
No. I might remove a twig and a leaf that might obscure the frame, but I don't compose. All these things I find are as I find them.
the variety, I think,
arrange
it's
things.
just very, very striking. As you go from colorful, abstract impression
Right.
from coconuts in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
Nice contrast.
Well,
What else did you bring?
this is one of my more popular shots. One that I took back in 2004 when I first started getting serious about fine art photography. And this again is a natural extract.
I think I saw this on Rocky Neck. Did you have
Yes,
that up?
I have that. I had this in a large print framed on the wall there, as well as the Boatyard Blues. This is the one I think that caught your eye, and you.
Yeah, I remember looking at
Yeah.
that for some time. I don't.
So this is
yeah.
a smaller print of that
Yeah.
same one. I show that in a print that.
We're just.
Yeah. But
just keep
so this
going.
is again a natural extract, and this is a photograph I took at the Audubon Sanctuary in Rowley.
Uh,
not in Raleigh, I'm sorry, in Topsfield. And there's a pond there called the Fowl Pond, Fowl
so where
pond.
you can rent canoes in that area? Is that,
You can, but in the Audubon Sanctuary proper, people do canoe by, but this is just a little rivulet that's draining out of the Fowl Pond underneath a boardwalk that you can walk across. So on the downhill side, there's just a little stream running away, and these ripples are from the water surface tension pulling the water and making these striations, sort of like if you pull taffy, you get those strings.
yeah.
So these are parallel to the direction of flow of the water.
It's a little out of focus, though.
Which is out of focus?
Me.
Oh, you are. Oh, okay. I can't help
No,
that.
they're just talking to themselves.
Oh,
They're,
okay.
they're talking to the director.
All right. But anyway, so you see in here basically three layers of autumn leaves. You see leaves that are in the stream underwater, leaves that are on the stream side over the water, and you see the foliage reflected from the trees overhead on the surface of the water.
Is this an example of a photograph where you had to go back again and again for the perfect time and the
Well,
perfect light, and the perfect angles?
I did revisit this scene in subsequent years, and the first photograph I took of this was much more muted. And actually, when I first took the series of photos of this, I did not print this picture. It took another year for me to master the elements of Photoshop to be able to bring this image up from what was a relatively obscure image. I had problems with it, and then I had burnout on the highlights. And I learned how to control that and adjust for it
I
and
see,
bring the
I see,
highlights
I
back
see.
out about a year later. If I weren't a pack rat, I might have discarded that image and never had it. And it's become one of my most successful shots. This is
I remember that very clearly.
yeah.
That struck me.
I make limited editions of 50 prints, and I'm up to number 14 on this one.
With the
in
same
sales.
printer.
With
With the same printer that you
the
used,
same, yeah.
the
this-
same machine.
Well, this was printed on a 2200, a slightly smaller machine. I use the 3800 for larger prints and the 2200 for the smaller ones.
You have, I notice here, a photograph of recognizable structures.
Oh,
And
I do that occasionally too. Here's
uh,
a picture I took last summer with my friend Mike Lipton. We were walking back up Haskell Street from the dinghy dock at Cripple Cove, and we had raced in a storm. There was storm clouds brewing all around us when we finished sailing, and we zoomed in the dinghy and walked up the street from Cripple Cove up Haskell Street. And I saw,
is this Haskell?
this is Haskell Street. This is the corner of Haskell and Blake. In fact, that's the title of this piece.
Ah.
It's called
Is
Haskell
that,
and Blake. That's my
your
buddy
friend?
Mike. And he was walking up the hill ahead of me, and I saw the red Cadillac, and I saw the red roof, and I saw his red jacket, and the dramatic light.
And the flag.
And I was
too,
getting a picture of basically the dramatic light of the dark sky and the light, bright on the houses, great quality of light. And I saw these red things converging, so I stopped, and I waited for Michael to walk through the frame to get that beautiful shot. And I love it because it's a picture that tells a story.
It does, and that composition, the corner reds,
Yeah.
the lower and the central reds, very, very nicely done. And it's fascinating for me because I've only done a little bit of amateur photography
Yeah.
to see how much you bring to make sure that the camera is taking what the imagination sees. And most
Well,
people don't.
When I
They
took the
don't
course,
translate.
when I took the course with Minor White, the course I took with him was Creative Audience, was the name of the course. And in that, we didn't take pictures so much as look at pictures
Ooh.
and evaluate them. And we would do exercises, for instance, lying down upside down, lying down on the floor on our backs and looking upside down at images and seeing what we saw in them, what we saw in shapes and compositions. And Minor White's whole, or not his whole gestalt, but a good part of it is pre-visualizing in a scene the elements that you find striking that you wish to render in the final photograph. So you see a scene and you think what the photograph will be, and not only that, what effect that image is going to have on your audience. So that's why the course is called Creative Audience. And that's something that I'm often very conscious of when I take the picture. What are the elements in here that resonate with me? What makes my hair stand on end? And how can I communicate that to someone else to give them the same electric charge that I got when I saw it?
You see a lot of people taking pictures who are not professional, even amateurs, but they are elated to be taking pictures of their friends at an important site, and they think that they're going to take a picture of their excitement,
And
it
it'll
doesn't
come
work.
through.
Doesn't work. The
Well,
excitement is not
if I were
photographable.
to take a picture of your excitement right now, I would get like really close, and I would have like your nose, your eye, and a big and part of a grin, and that to me would communicate it more than if I took a full what some Hollywood producers call a close up with the feet.
As you say, get close and then get closer.
Get closer.
That was that one of White's?
Yeah. No, that was
movie?
Edward Weston.
Ah,
That was really his gestalt. So should we go to something that's
Yes,
sort of in
please.
between?
yes.
All right. Well, here is an image that is not really an extract.
I recognize reeds, I think.
Yeah, reeds.
Pussy willows? Or no, the
Well, it's
leaves.
a picture of Gravelly Pond, which is one of the feeder ponds to Lake Chabaco over in Essex.
Ah,
And a late day shot with bright sunlight, sun about to set, shining on foliage across the pond, illuminating it and it reflecting in the water. These are birch trees upside down, and the distant shore is just along the rim. So that's basically inverted picture of birch trees, highly illuminated by setting sun. And
upside down, just as you mentioned, White's exercise.
they're upside down,
that you
but
took
it's
when
the
you were
composition
studying
and the
with them.
color and the flow that attracted my eye. And what centers the image, in my estimation, is the reflection of these reeds and of these pond plants. You have an incident reflection right across the middle of the picture. So these are up and those are down, and
That looks almost
have
like a
symmetry.
horizon, kind of the effect of a horizon
right,
running through
a
the
reflected horizon. And this is another one of my very popular sort of signature shots.
Do you have something else? We have only about less than 6 minutes left.
Well,
And
here's something I took
I-
inside the paint factory. And this is actually, I show this picture horizontally and I call it greenscape. I took the picture as a vertical. And it is a photograph of a window in their printing room with all the contaminated paint fluids leaking down from the ceiling above on a piece of glass that's illuminated from the back by a window looking outside behind it. So this is actually I got that upside down. This is the way it was when I took the picture. This is just flaky bits of paint, and that's basically toxic copper leachate, copper oxide, green.
Yeah.
And this is the way I show it. It's greenscape. Very often I take pictures because of the quality of light in them. And here's a picture I took over at the Gloucester Marine Railways. This one I call inner light. And again, it's a natural extract.
Is that the setting sun hitting that
It's actually a security light.
that window?
It's a security light in Madfish Alley.
Not as romantic as I imagined.
That's shining through the back window of their old machine shop underneath the office at Gloucester Marine Railway, with all the presses and drill presses and boxes of things being stored in there. And I'm taking the picture from the outside looking in. I call that one inner light.
Very nice. I know the location.
Here's
I know the
one.
location.
Here's one that I like a lot. I showed this in Rocky Neck at our spring show a couple years ago, and I have some friends of mine who are attorneys and psychologists clustered around it, about a dozen of them, saying, "What the hell is going on in there?" I spoiled it for them by telling them.
It looks like a scrim used on stage.
It is.
Is it?
Exactly right. A scrim on stage. This was in Sowa, They had a trash fashion show. And this is where the models would prep before they came out on the runway stage. Here's a model who's just walked in behind the scrim. All you see is her foot. Here's one who's looking at herself in the mirror. And here's one who's already been through and is gazing out at the audience. So you're quite right. It is the scrim. And, you know, I look for opportunities where the light paints a picture, and capturing that elusive light is really what a lot of my
I just got
work
the
is about.
3-minute signal from Chris, our photographer, who was working with Marjan on
Okay.
this program. So if we could do one more,
All right. Well, I'm
and then
going to
have to begin to.
I'm going to show you this one that you asked me originally. Are they spontaneous shots? This is the picture I was telling you about that I stalked for 6 weeks, and kept coming back in the fall at high tide when the weather and the clouds and the conditions were right. So it
It's,
took me almost 2 months of work to get that shot.
It's very much like Yeats talking about poetry. You work on a line
Yeah.
for weeks, but if it doesn't look like it was thought of in a second,
Right.
it doesn't work.
Happy accident.
Yeah.
Okay, I
That's,
got one shot to close.
Oh,
for you.
yes.
All right,
The
because
snow-
I thought this would be
the snow
appropriate,
shed.
since the title of your show is The Writer's Block, I'm going to brought you one picture and admonish you and your audience and all your guests.
Do not block. Now that we can interpret. That's and where is that? Is that in Gloucester?
That's the same. That's the underneath the Gloucester Marine Railway office.
Is that the window we were looking for
That's the
earlier?
same window. We're looking at
A
it in
little different
daylight.
tone.
We're looking
little
at it in
different tone.
daylight instead of at nightlight, but that's the same
Very nice,
window
very
behind the
nice.
light shining through.
We can leave
So-
that there while I close here.
Yeah. So I thought
I w-
I thought this was just so humorous.
It is.
Do not block, but you can't tell Mother Nature
The-
what to block and not block.
No. I'm not looking forward to winter, but there's nothing I can do about it. Tom Robinson Cox, I want to thank you very much for coming down tonight
You're
and
welcome.
exploring photography. As I mentioned, it's a very big treat for us at the studio to have a non-writer on
Right.
and talk about a different medium. Thanks for coming down.
Well, I've often heard it said that a picture is worth 1,000 words.
I believe it after speaking with you tonight. I want to thank our audience in Cable Land for being with us on the Writer's Block tonight. If you've learned something about the art and magic of photography from Tom Robinson Cox, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.